Welcome to the Silicon Valley Health Institute. We are a nonprofit organization. We want to get leading experts and their information to the public so we can be proactive in taking care of our health. We don't believe in sick care or disease management where we wait till something happens and wait for the magic pill from the prescription pad. So here we are. Today we have an expert who is known for his work on grain belly, and I was absolutely fascinated by his last book, Super Gut, which you can see in the background, on how to lose weight. I mean, this is something we're all concerned about because most of us are going toward obesity, which has so many different health risks. So Dr. William Davis is a cardiologist, author of the groundbreaking #1 New York bestseller, Wheat Belly, and 3 other New York Times bestsellers, Wheat Belly Cookbook, Wheat Belly 30 Minutes or Less Cookbook, and Wheat Belly Total Health, and several other books, including Wheat Belly 10-Day Grain Detox and Undoctored. His most recent book, which I found fascinating, Super Gut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight. This maps out the damage that has occurred with a modern human microbiome and all the things we do to it, and gives specific actionable steps that can be taken to restore our microbiome to maximum advantage. We know the microbiome is key in all of our health. Dr. Davis champions programs that empower the individual in health in our world, which the healthcare system is failing us. It's failing to provide unbiased information and services. He's the co-founder and chief medical officer of the Realize Therapeutics Corp. In Lake Bluff, Illinois, a commercial project to help fund research and develop therapeutic products, applying the new science of the microbiome. He is active in various online activities, including his Wheat Belly blog, which has 33 million views, and transitioned to his Dr. Davis Infinite Health website. He also has broadcast his message through his Infinite Health YouTube channel. He's got apparently weekly bi-directional Zoom meetings. He's a graduate of the St. Louis University School of Medicine with training in internal medicine and cardiovascular disease, and advanced training in interventional procedures such as the Case Western Reserve University Hospital. He also serves as a director of cardiovascular fellowship and assistant professor of medicine. He lives in Milwaukee. Welcome, Dr. Davis. We want to learn all about dieting, how to do it, and how to get healthy by losing our abdominal fat. But
thanks, Dr. Susan.
Fat, more important.
So I do have slides if you're interested, but it's a really cool time to have this conversation because we have this absolute disaster developing, not just obesity, but the proliferation, the popularity of these GLP-1 agonist drugs. These are drugs like Wegovy, Mounjaro, and Ozempic. And a lot of our colleagues are saying things like, oh, these are miraculous, they're breakthroughs, not recognizing that they destroy people's health. The FDA should never have approved them. So maybe your friend pays $12,000, right? So a lot of money flows into pharma because of this. So she pays $12,000 and loses maybe 40 pounds. She's very proud of herself. Of those 40 pounds, 10 to 15 pounds is muscle. That's critical. So think about 10 pounds of ground beef on your kitchen table. It's a lot of muscle to lose. Well, she lost 10 to 15 pounds of muscle. She stops the drug. Not everybody can afford that forever, right? She stops the drug, right? She regains 32 to 34 pounds, nearly all fat. Very little muscle comes back after that. Well, now, after having spent a lot of money, she is now more prone to type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, hypertension, coronary disease, dementia, and breast cancer. She's more at risk, worse off than she was at the start. So she paid $12,000 to have her health deteriorate. And that's what the FDA approved, this garbage class of drug. So you're given a choice. You can stay in the drug forever and flow a huge amount of revenue into the pharmaceutical industry, or you can stop the drug and have your health destroyed. And it all centers around this very important factor that you lose muscle. Muscle is the principal determinant of what's called basal metabolic rate. That's the rate at which your body burns calories for the work of living, breathing, digestion, all that kind of stuff. Well, your metabolic rate drops by about 25% when you lose that much muscle. So even if you go off the drug, you maintain a low calorie intake, misery, right? But you maintain a low calorie intake and an exercise program that includes strength training, you're guaranteed to regain the weight. So you paid all that money, you cause your health to deteriorate, and you regain all the weight. That's what these people are doing. Now, Dr. Susan, I do have a collection of slides on this topic if you'd like me to do that.
Well, yeah, the topic is fascinating. I muted myself because I don't want background noise. But yeah, it's fascinating because there's so much involved in this. I mean, because we can lose the weight and abdominal fat, but we inevitably regain the weight because our metabolic rate goes down, and we need that for metabolism. And then we don't regain the muscle, and when we exercise we can't mitigate this, so we don't get the muscle back, and it is a real as I say, an emergency room cluster, so which means it's a bad situation. So I mean, it's just so interesting. And then you talk about the microbiome and such stuff, such as L-reuteri, which increases oxytocin and does all sorts of good things. You've got this plan. If you can discuss it, I mean, including taking curcumin and berberine, which will help the gut lining, and they stay in the gut unless you do something to help it absorb. I mean, all these fascinating tidbits. I wonder if you could touch on those.
Sure. So we have done damage to our gastrointestinal microbiomes. So by age 40, most of us have taken 30 courses of antibiotics. For every 1,000 children, there's over 1,300 prescriptions written every year for antibiotics. And a lot of these prescriptions are unnecessary or inappropriate. Not all of them, of course, but probably half, according to the CDC. And that's probably a conservative estimate. And so our overexposure to antibiotics, other factors that disrupt the microbiome, preservatives in food. Preservatives kill mold and other contaminants in food. And they also are antimicrobial in you. Synthetic mixing agents like carboxymethylcellulose or polysorbate 80, very common in ice cream, for instance. Massive disruption of your GI microbiome. Stomach acid blocking drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. A long list of factors have disrupted the gastrointestinal microbiome. Well, there are a collection of microbes that are very critical for your health, but are very susceptible to common antibiotics. One of them, as Dr. Susan points out, is Lactobacillus reuteri, named after the German microbiologist who discovered in 1962, Dr. Gerhard Reuter. He found it in the breast milk of a breastfeeding mother. And in his 40-year academic career in Germany, he found it increasingly difficult to find anymore. In 1962, he could get it in breast milk, in stool, and other body fluids. By the turn of the century, he couldn't find it anymore. So it's disappeared. It's virtually disappeared from the human gastrointestinal microbiome. That's one of many microbes that disappeared. But Reuteri is really, it's the first microbe I chose to play around with and experiment with, because there was a series of very elegant studies in mice going back about 10 years, 8 to 10 years. And this was a cancer group. And they were exploring the anti-cancer effects of Lactobacillus reuteri, because reuteri, when restored, inhibits the formation of polyps in your colon, precancerous polyps. It can eradicate cancer cells. So they were exploring that question. But they noticed that the mice who were given reuteri also had, in their words, rich, luxuriant fur within a week. So what is this about? So they explored what's going on in these mice, and they found that their skin thickness, the dermal thickness, increased dramatically. That is dermal collagen. I know a lot of ladies are interested in collagen. So a lot of ladies put on topical things on the epidermis, but the seat of skin health is the dermis, just below the epidermis. The epidermis is dead. The dermis is alive, and it's very active. Well, when animals get this Lactobacillus reuteri, there's an explosion in dermal collagen, big increase in thickness. They heal about half normal time. Their mating behavior increases, sexual behavior. Testosterone in old male mice goes up 300%. Growth hormone goes up about 3-fold. There's an increase in Leydig cell size. Those are cells in the testicles that produce testosterone. There's increase in bone activity, regrowth of bone and of cartilage. So I saw these data. I thought, let's try this in humans, because you can get that microbe they were testing commercially, but you could only get it at the time as tablets made for infants. So the dose was very tiny. So I asked, how can we get big doses? Well, you could take 100 tablets a day. That's kind of stupid, right? So I made yogurt. It's not yogurt. Don't confuse this with the stuff at the grocery store. It just happens when we make it to look and smell like commercial yogurt, but it's not. We take this microbe, we're going to ferment this. And microbes don't have sex, right? There's no mommy and daddy microbes. Microbes just reproduce themselves. One becomes two, two becomes four. Well, Lactobacillus reuteri doubles every 3 hours or so at human body temperature. So let's get a device. It could be a yogurt maker, could be a sous vide meat cooker, it could be any device that holds your mixture at about 100 degrees, give or take, 98, 100, something like that. And we're going to do it for 36 hours. Because if reuteri doubles every 3 hours, we're going to let it double 12 times. We do that. We get this rich, thick, yogurt-like food. I did flow cytometry on the yogurts. We get about 300 billion counts. So we increase the counts of microbes from those original tablets about 1,000-fold. So 300 billion per half cup serving, served with some blueberries or chia seeds or whatever. And all the effects, to my great surprise, all the effects seen in mice, we see in humans, such as loss of crow's feet and smile lines, lessening of all wrinkles, increased sebum production, moisture. Guys get about a 50% rise in testosterone. Ladies who are experiencing vaginal dryness or atrophy, it comes back to normal. Libido goes up. Your healing is faster. There are many effects mediated, as Dr. Susan points out, by hormone oxytocin. So reuteri sends a signal via the vagus nerve up through the neck and to the brain to release oxytocin. And oxytocin increases the intensity of love and affection for other people. It increases your sense of generosity. It increases, this is my favorite, your acceptance of other people's opinions, even if you disagree. Isn't that interesting? And so I saw all this play out in humans, dramatic changes, but also changes in body composition. So rather, you lose abdominal visceral fat. That's the most problematic form of fat because it's inflammatory and it's a source of insulin resistance. So you lose abdominal visceral fat and you regain youthful muscle. So the exact opposite of those GLP-1 garbage drugs. So personally, I didn't expect this. Personally, I started eating the yogurt and I was in my 60s at the time. And I gained 13 pounds of muscle in 3 weeks, doing almost nothing. By the way, going to the gym minimally, because I don't like going to the gym. So I gained 13 pounds of muscle, and my strength increased by 50%. So I do like a lat pull down, right? Maybe 10 repetitions with the 130 pounds. Within 3 weeks, in my 60s, I'm doing 200 pounds. By going to the gym maybe 15 minutes once a week. So now think about this. Reduced abdominal fat, the kind of fat we gain as we get older. A restoration of youthful muscle, smoother skin, more moist skin, amplification of your immune response, improved healing, accelerated healing, increased libido, increased testosterone in males, that restoration of vaginal health in females. I don't think it's a stretch to say what we're doing, what we're achieving is turning the clock back 10 or 20 years. So where people take those GLP-1 idiotic drugs and they get what's called Ozempic face, maybe you've heard that term, they lose a bunch of weight, but they look older, 20 years older, because they lost subcutaneous beneath the skin fat and muscle. They look 20 years older. We're seeing the opposite. Restoration of muscle, loss of abdominal visceral fat, and looking 10 to 20 years younger.
This is so fascinating, and there's so many things about it. What's really interesting is when you talk about, we do calorie reduction, we lose the weight, our metabolic rate goes down. It's a setup. The weight will come back. It'll come back as belly fat, and you'll be in a worse condition, more risk for insulin resistance, diabetes, dementia, cognitive decline, depression, anxiety, and many other things about which you are an expert. And we can't mitigate the muscle loss no matter what exercises. That doesn't come back. And when we lose weight, I understand we lose like 25% of his muscle. Bad thing. So you've got this program that of not necessarily weight loss, but visceral fat loss, because the fat around the organs is much more important than what's protruding in your belly. But your program, you did an experiment, and people, without changing their diet, lost inches around the waist, maybe not lose weight, but increase muscle. We have to know about that.
So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I try to focus on is restoring things that we've lost. So, Lactobacillus reuteri, we've lost, right? Because of its susceptibility to common antibiotics. Because of the silly advice to cut fat and cut cholesterol. So people did that. And what happened? People got fat and diabetic. So this is a product of two things, of US dietary guidelines and of predatory exploitative practices of big food. So, but one of the side effects of cutting fat and cholesterol is most modern people have abandoned consumption of organ meats, tongue, heart, brain. Well, when you abandon consumption of organ meats, your intake of collagen and hyaluronic acid plummets. And when you lose collagen and you lose hyaluronic acid in your diet, you get accelerated skin aging, thinner skin. You get accelerated deterioration of your joints, because joint cartilage is made of collagen, and joint lubricating fluid, synovial fluid, is made of hyaluronic acid. You get accelerated deterioration of the reproductive system in females, because the uterus, cervix, and vagina is largely hyaluronic acid. You get acceleration of arterial aging, because the collagen lines the arteries, and hyaluronic acid also lines the arteries, the so-called glycocalyx, the signaling molecules in your arteries. So the low-fat, low-cholesterol message caused us to lose those nutrients that cause accelerated aging. So I add them back. Now, most people say, yuck, I'm not going to eat brain. I'm not going to eat tongue. So we get it as a supplement, collagen peptides. We get hyaluronic acid. And by the way, a lot of ladies say, oh, I know all about hyaluronic acid. I put it around my eyes every night as a serum. I pay a ton of money for this stuff. And it does work. But I ask them this. Okay, you apply it around your eyes and you think you reduce some of the wrinkles. What did it do to your neck skin or your abdomen or your thigh? Nothing. Body-wide. And it improves your eyes, and improves your reproductive health, improves your joint health. And hyaluronic acid, people don't think of it this way. Hyaluronic acid is a fiber. Fibers come from plants, right? Asparagus, onions, garlic, right? But hyaluronic acid is a fiber that comes from animals, especially brain, skin, and tongue. And so we add back this fiber, and you have a bloom in beneficial microbiome species you've probably never heard of, like Akkermansia or Fecalibacterium or Lactospiraceae, Ruminicaceae. These are very important microbes because they produce a fatty acid called butyric acid that has many benefits, including reduction of abdominal fat and better skin health, because it acidifies the skin, discourages the growth of pathogens, reduces redness. And because, people who have psoriasis, rosacea, and acne, and all skin, all have less acidic skin. So healthy skin is acidic. Unhealthy skin, less acidic. When you get butyric acid, because you took hyaluronic acid orally, not topically, orally, you acidify your skin, you discourage growth of pathogenic microbes like Staphylococcus aureus. You allow beneficial microbes to grow like Staphylococcus epidermidis, and you decrease the pH. You acidify the skin. You have healthier, younger looking skin. So we've got reuteri we're going to replace because it's lost. We're going to replace the collagen and hyaluronic acid that we abandoned because of stupid advice to cut fat and cholesterol. And we're going to also be mindful of our carotenoid intake, because most modern produce that is supposed to supply with carotenoids, like beta-carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, and astaxanthin, we're supposed to get that from wild plants, wild foods, wild salmon. Well, guess what? Most people don't do that. They get their food in a clamshell that is delivered to their house or a drive-through window. And carotenoid intake has plummeted. And carotenoid intake is a potent anti-inflammatory. It shrinks abdominal fat. It reduces the phenomena of so-called inflammation, the inflammation that accompanies aging. And I chose astaxanthin as we can't give you, there's 600 carotenoids. We can't give you all 600, right? So I chose the most powerful antioxidative one, that's astaxanthin, in teensy-weensy doses. I put them together. Now, the ladies in my audience, I have a large female audience, they all say, you know what? We don't really care about the empathy or the muscle or the bone health. We just want better skin. And I said, what? Really? Oh, okay, fine. So I did a small clinical trial, as Dr. Susan points out, 25 ladies. I asked them, please don't change your diet. Please don't change your exercise program. Just get these 4 things. We gave it to them in capsule form. Lactobacillus reuteri, collagen peptides, in this case, marine source collagen peptides. When you use marine source collagen peptides, it's effective at about 1/10 of the dose of bovine porcine or chicken. So reuteri, collagen peptides, marine sourced, hyaluronic acid, and the carotenoid astaxanthin. These ladies took those 4 things for 90 days, and they were very happy with the loss of wrinkles. They felt more youthful. Ladies who are 60 look more like they're 40, right? So they're real happy. But I also measured their waist circumference. Even though this was a clinical trial for skin, it's free, right? We have a low budget. So we measured waist circumference. And lo and behold, they lost a ton of abdominal fat. I did not expect that. Did not expect it at all. As much as 8.5 inches, or about 22 centimeters off their waist circumference. Now, even more crazily, they didn't lose weight. Now, wait a minute. How can that be? How can you lose up to 8.5 inches off your waist and not lose weight? Well, I believe consistent with the animal evidence, consistent with our experience, large anecdotal experience, it's an increase in muscle. Now, we have more clinical trials planned to do measures of muscle like DEXA and that sort of thing, but we see it play out in real people. There's an increase in muscle, probably on about 7 to 8 pounds. Now, ladies say, I don't want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Don't worry, you won't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you went to the gym maybe 3 hours a day and could bench press 500 pounds, no one's going to do that, right? So we're talking about, as Dr. Susan points out, trying to get away from this idea of, I'm going to lose weight. And let's instead say, I'm going to restore youthful body composition, loss of abdominal fat, some subcutaneous fat, and restoration of youthful muscle, because that muscle, remember, is the primary determinant of your metabolic rate. So your metabolic rate goes up. You burn energy more quickly, and you have better control over metabolism. And you know what? More muscle means you're less prone to prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, coronary disease, cognitive impairment, breast cancer, frailty, fractures. So I believe what we're doing is turning the clock back 10, 20 years by introducing favorable effects on body composition by restoring factors lost in modern people.
This is fascinating, and we all want to know where to get these things. And I suspect the answer is to go get the book Super Gut, because as I understand it, you delineate these very clearly and how to do this. Is there any of this information where we can get this you want to share now, or do we wait till we buy your book?
Well, as you point out, Dr. Susan, one of the things I did was form a company. And when you form a company and have a product, you can get a lot of hot water if you mention the product when you're talking about research. So I'm sorry, I can't mention the product, but know that there's a commercial product out there that you can get that achieves a lot of these effects, but I can't say the name. But a lot of this is also in the Super Gut book, How to Cultivate Reuteri. And by the way, that's one microbe. There are many others. So there's another really cool microbe. So well, I should mention this. One of the reasons that Lactobacillus reuteri and a couple other microbes like Lactobacillus gasseri, one of the reasons they're so wonderful, lost by almost everybody, One of the reasons why they're so powerful is, in addition to all those things I mentioned, muscle, oxytocin, etc., these microbes, unlike most other microbes of the microbiome, colonize the small intestine as well as the colon. Most microbes colonize the colon only, but these microbes, beneficial microbes, colonize the small intestine, the 24 feet of small intestine, where they take up residence and produce what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics effective against fecal microbes. Because as Dr. Susan points out, over half the US population has allowed the overproliferation of fecal microbes that ascended up from the colon where they belong up into the 24 feet of small intestine where they don't belong. You may not know this. You may experience it as hypertension or atrial fibrillation or anxiety or depression or cognitive impairment or Parkinson's disease or obesity or type 2 diabetes or psoriasis or rosacea or eczema. In other words, so many thousands of health conditions need to be re-examined in light of the contribution of the microbiome, especially when fecal microbes inhabit the small intestine.
Yeah, why don't you tell us more about these fecal microbes inhabiting the small intestines? This is called SIBO, and as you've said, this is so much more common than any of us could have imagined, and it is so connected with so many other diseases such as fatty liver disease, etc. So tell us more about this fermenting upper gut, SIBO, etc.
Sure. So all those things we've been exposed, antibiotics, preservatives, etc., allowed fecal microbes that are supposed to be in the colon. These are species like E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter. Remember those ones that also cause food poisoning? So your colon is well equipped to handle those microbes, whether it's through food poisoning or through stool, right? But your small intestine is not. The small intestine is poorly equipped to handle fecal microbes. It's got a thinner single-layer mucus barrier, unlike the colon, which is a thicker two-layer mucus barrier. Its ability to fight off these organisms is less because the small intestine is built for absorption of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, etc. But when fecal microbes come to inhabit the 24 feet of small intestine, these creatures don't live very long. They live for a few hours, not years, a few hours. So trillions of microbes invading the small intestine, living and dying rapidly. When they die, they release some of the components of their little cells, including something in their wall called endotoxin. And that endotoxin is able to gain entry through this intestinal wall into the bloodstream. That process is called endotoxemia, or some people say gut leak. That's been suspected for many years by many people, but it was finally validated by a European group in 2007, corroborated many times since. So this process of endotoxemia, the entry of bacterial breakdown products into your bloodstream, is how microbes in the small intestine, and to some degree in the colon also, are experienced as something in the brain, like dementia or anxiety, or in the skin, like psoriasis or rosacea, or in muscle and joints, like fibromyalgia or rheumatoid arthritis, or as a metabolic disease, like obesity or fatty liver or type 2 diabetes. So you can imagine if you have, let's say, if you're a diabetic and you're being given insulin and metformin and some other drugs, injectable drugs, have they addressed the SIBO and the endotoxemia driving that No. What happens when you fail to address the SIBO? Other diseases emerge, right? You're diabetic, now you're hypertensive, now you have coronary disease, and you have peripheral vascular disease, and you have depression, and you have dementia, because they failed to address the SIBO and endotoxemia. It also can lead to ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and colon cancer, and diverticular disease. And so the failure to identify and correct that causative process, and as Dr. Susan points out, it is far more common than anyone ever thought. All you have to do, I did this some years back, go through all the studies that ask this question: in condition blank, what proportion of people test positive for SIBO? Usually measuring hydrogen gas in the breath, because hydrogen is produced by microbes, not by you. So let's insert in condition irritable bowel syndrome, right? What proportion tests positive? Well, there's about 60 to 70 million Americans with irritable bowel syndrome, and roughly 31% test positive. It varies from study to study, but it's average about 31%. Well, that's about 18 to 20 million people right there. How about in obesity? What proportion tests positive for SIBO? Well, there's 115 million obese Americans. So 50% test positive. That's another 55 or so million Americans. 55 go through ulcerative colitis, fibromyalgia, type 2 diabetes, depression, neurodegenerative conditions. Add them all up. Now, there's some overlap, right? Obese, type 2 diabetic with fatty liver. But add up, you'll see you easily exceed 150 million Americans easily, or 1 in 2. Look left, look to your right, you're going to see somebody with SIBO and endotoxemia. Now, but it's easy as heck to get rid of in most cases. Most people don't know that. If you go, sadly, Dr. Susan knows this. You go to the local gastroenterologist and say, hey, Doc, I think I have SIBO. He says, what are you talking about? Did you consult Dr. Google again? Or he says, why? You say, well, I'm seeing fat droplets in the toilet. Or I have multiple food intolerances. I can't eat nuts or eggs or nightshades or FODMAPs or fibers. I can't eat any of those things. Or I have a condition like fibromyalgia that is synonymous with SIBO. The doctor, if the doctor knows something about it, he or she will say, here's a prescription for Xifaxan, an antibiotic. Now, wait a minute. Antibiotics got us here. Do you really want an antibiotic to fix a situation? It's expensive, not covered by insurance, so a very flawed solution. Of course, the doctor doesn't tell you how to prevent the recurrences that are very common. So what I've been doing, this is what I did. So let's say you have SIBO, 24 feet, fecal microbes inhabiting your small intestine, and you've got all kinds of problems. You can't lose weight, you're depressed, right? So you got joint pain, skin rashes. Well, what if you took a commercial probiotic right off the shelf? Will it go away? No. You might have a reduction in bloating, maybe a little reduction in diarrhea, but that's about it. You still got 24 feet of small intestinal fecal microbes. So I asked these questions. What if we chose species and strains of microbes that colonize the small intestine? That's where all this occurs, right? That's where the battle is. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. And what if we chose species and strains that are known to produce those bacteriocins, natural antibiotics, effective against fecal microbes? So I chose 3. I chose our friend Lactobacillus reuteri. I had Lactobacillus gasseri, because both those colonize the small intestine and produce multiple bacteriocins. And I chose a spore-forming microbe, Bacillus coagulans. Bacillus coagulans does not colonize the small intestine, but it germinates. It's a spore, a seed, and it germinates in the small intestine and produces its own bacteriocins. So I did this in hopes maybe it provides some relief from bloating or some of the symptoms of SIBO. To my great surprise, of about 50 people who've done this so far, 90% have normalized their SIBO. Now, we're doing it because there's a home device you should know about. And I have no relationship with the manufacturer or the company. It's called AIRE, A-I-R-E. You blow in it, and it talks to your smartphone, 0 to 10, a rise of 4 units from baseline. So you blow into it. Let's say your starting level is 1.2, 0 to 10, right? And you eat something that feeds microbes. Let's say like inulin. Inulin's a fiber that microbes like to eat or metabolize. Well, you test again, say in 30 minutes, 9.8. Well, that's that inulin you took in, maybe in your coffee or something else. It can't get to your colon that fast, right? 30 minutes, where production of hydrogen gas is normal and expected. So if you're producing it within 90 minutes, hydrogen gas, you've got microbes, fecal microbes living in your stomach, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And so we take those 3 microbes and we ferment it. I call it SIBO yogurt, but don't confuse it with yogurt at the store. Completely different. We ferment all 3. Some people ferment them separately, either way. Ferment them all 3, 36 hours, consume half a cup a day over 4 weeks. And so far, 90% of people have generated normalization of hydrogen gas on their breath. And they say things like, wow, oh, my hemoglobin A1C finally dropped into the ideal range. I finally broke my weight loss plateau. I finally got rid of the last drug. I was on 3 drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, a biologic, prednisone, and naproxen. I was down to only naproxen as needed, but for occasional flares. Now I have no flares. So not only did we normalize hydrogen gas on the breath, we also saw improvement in many measures. Now, we will do a formal clinical trial to validate. I'm not a pharmaceutical company. I don't have billions and billions of dollars ripping people off to spend on research. So I've got to be careful in the money I spend on research, but I'd like to do that as a formal clinical trial. But think about this. If I said, Dr. Susan, the solution for SIBO is to remove your small intestine, Dr. Susan would say, well, you better be damn confident that's true. I want real good evidence that's true. But what if I said the solution for SIBO and all those health conditions could be something that looks and smells like yogurt that you make in your kitchen? Well, you don't have to be so confident, right? Because the solution is potentially so benign.
Wow, this is interesting. And, as you mentioned in your book, some of the symptoms of SIBO would be gas and bloating, especially after eating prebiotic foods such as root vegetables or foods containing inulin such as onions, fat intolerance, where we leave a stain in the bowl after bowel movement, recurring skin rashes. You also mentioned some of the contributing causes. It sounds like a bidirectional issue. Some of the contributing causes could be poorly controlled diabetes, low stomach acid, which we need for the digestion of all of our food to create the enzymes to stir up the bile. And if we don't have our food digested, then we've got undigested food, gets in the blood, you get antibodies, molecular mimicry, and start of autoimmune disease. Immune system can also play back and forth with SIBO. So one of the things you mentioned in your book, what about the growth of fungus? So tell us a little about that.
Oh, such a big issue, Dr. Susan. You're right. So a lot of people, so there's bacterial overgrowth, whether it's in the colon or, as we talked about, often in the small intestine. There can also be fungal overgrowth, both in the colon and in many people also in the small bowel. It can coexist with SIBO or with colonic dysbiosis, and it can also occur maybe independently. I'm a little skeptical that it can occur by itself because we all have fungi. Even if you are in absolute perfect health, you still have fungi. You got fungi in your colon, you got fungi in your skin and hair and vagina and armpits and under your breast. It's everywhere. But when something is disrupted and it allows fungi like Candida albicans, Candida glabrata, Malassezia, these are fungal species. When something changes in your microbiome, whether it's in the skin, vagina, gastrointestinal tract, it allows those fungi to proliferate. Now, sadly, we don't have a device like this to test for fungal overgrowth. So we're left with stool testing. Now, I would point out to your listeners, stool testing, useful, but think of stool testing as rectal testing. So when you submit a sample of poop for stool testing, it's a rectal sample. It's not a transverse colon sample. It's not an ileal sample. It's not a jejunal sample. It's a rectal. So I point that out because I have a friend, Dr. Raul Cano. He's an academic microbiologist. He did something extraordinary. He did several things. If you take the colon of an animal, and you have to kill the animal, and you sample the poop all along the length of the colon, the microbiome composition changes like every inch or so. It's all different. He also did this. He got humans to submit not a rectal sample, but the entire bowel movement, and then took a blender, softly blended it to homogenize it, and compared it to those rectal stool samples. And he saw that two completely different things. So always take those those stool tests with a grain of salt. They're okay. They do provide some answers, but I point this out, but it is useful. Stool rectal testing is still useful for fungal overgrowth. You can see the overgrowth of fungal species. Now, fungal species mimic SIBO in a lot of the symptoms, like gas and bloating, irritable bowel syndrome type symptoms. It can, but one telltale sign that's very reliable is sugar cravings. If you say, "Oh, I have a terrible sweet tooth. I can't turn away from candy or chocolate, whatever," that is often fungal overgrowth. By the way, that's also from wheat consumption. The gliadin protein of wheat is only partially digestible, and it becomes opioids and stimulates cravings for food. It increases appetite. So that, but it's worsened by fungal overgrowth. Now, fungal overgrowth is a tough thing to get rid of. It's tougher than bacterial because fungi are really good at forming what's called a biofilm, a protective film where they can hide, they can sequester themselves. And they're very good at generating resistance. So if you think you have fungal overgrowth because you have sugar cravings, terrible sugar cravings, or you did some stool testing and it showed too many fungi like Candida glabrata or tropicalis or another, we take kind of this long and soft approach to it. I would still do something like SIBO yoga because if you have fungal overgrowth, even if you test negative for hydrogen gas, I still think there's some measure of bacterial disruption. So we take steps to make a better bacterial environment. And then we take things that are antifungal. Berberine, right? Non-absorbable berberine is useful for this. We also use food-sourced essential oils, but you got to be real careful with those essential oils because they're very caustic. They burn. They'll burn a hole in your. So what we do is take very small quantities, like oil of oregano is a good one, clove oil is another one, cinnamon oil another, and we take a drop or two and dilute it in a tablespoon of a healthy oil, like olive oil or avocado oil, and we do that a couple times a day. You want to do at least two things because those fungi are so good at generating resistance, and we do that for about 4 weeks, and we've seen a lot of people eradicate their fungal overgrowth. But it's another example of the disruption of the microbiome, and I see people struggling for decades with fungal overgrowth, not recognizing. They thought it was bad food or bad genetics or whatever. No, it can be fungal overgrowth.
Does fasting help with any of these conditions?
Fasting, there's a lot of, as you know, a lot of misunderstanding what is accomplished by fasting. Let's talk about fasting, not so much time-restricted eating. It's a little bit different. But fasting can have beneficial effects. For instance, one of the things that can happen with fasting, pardon me, is an increase in the population of a very important microbe, Akkermansia muciniphila. So Akkermansia is a very dominant microbe in the human GI tract. About 3 to 5% of all microbes in the normal GI tract is Akkermansia. Akkermansia helps produce mucus to protect you and your intestinal lining. It produces butyrate. It's a very good supporter of other beneficial microbes. When you fast, you increase its population a little bit. Maybe you go from 3.5% to 5%. But here's where it goes sour. Akkermansia, like many other microbes, loves to eat fibers, like the fibers in root vegetables and legumes. They metabolize these fibers to that butyrate we talked about. Well, deprive Akkermansia of fibers, as people do when they're keto or carnivorous or extended fasting. So you deprive Akkermansia of the fibers it wants. Well, it has this added advantage in that it can live on human mucus. So its full name is Akkermansia muciniphila, mucus lover. And Akkermansia, when you deprive it of fibers, starts to eat your intestinal mucus barrier. So when you deprive Akkermansia of fibers, it starts to consume human mucus in your intestines, and you get intestinal inflammation, colitis, other forms of intestinal inflammation. You get an increase in endotoxemia, and that leads to weight gain, higher triglycerides, fatty liver, prediabetes, insulin resistance, cognitive impairment, anxiety, depression. In other words, so for brief periods, intermittent fasting or other forms of fiber deprivation, like ketogenic diets and carnivorous diets, in the short term, beneficial. Do it for more than, no one knows exactly when, but probably after a few weeks, bad things start to happen. Do you remember the old Atkins diet? So people say, I did the Atkins diet. I lost 47 pounds. My waist shrunk. I don't have high blood pressure anymore. But about a year and a half in, people say, hey, I'm regaining weight. My waist is getting bigger. My triglycerides are going up. My blood sugar is going up. People say, oh, we're not doing the diet right. And I say, I am doing the diet right. That was from disruption of the microbiome. Now, that was so long ago, right? 1970s and 80s. No one knew about the microbiome like we're starting to learn. But what they were doing was disrupting the microbiome. Among the effects is overproliferation of Akkermansia. So Akkermansia, ideally about 4 or 5%, 3 to 5% of all microbes. When you do this, when you go ketogenic, carnivorous, or prolonged fasting, it can increase to 24%, 36%. It becomes incredibly dominant, and it's eating you.
Well, you were one of the original people warning us about gluten, and you've got so many different things to say about it. How about, such as increasing our appetite, blocking cholecystokines, which will stimulate the gallbladder, so many different things. Can you tell us some of those? Because it's fascinating.
Oh, sure, Dr. Susan. I'm so impressed at how much you know about these things I talk about. But so in the 1960s, there was a research effort to increase the yield per acre of wheat and corn and soy. This is in a research facility east of Mexico City, in Mexico, funded by the U.S. government, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Mexican government. And it was a good cause. It was meant to increase yield per acre to help feed the world's population. And they succeeded. Through extreme thousands of experiments, they increased the yield of wheat. They increased the yield between 4 and 8 folds. You imagine your farmer in his 1 acre plot has an increase of 4 to 8 times. So he's going to make more money. He's going to produce more food, right? But they changed the plant completely. So people think of wheat like it used to look, 4.5, 5 feet tall, right? Amber waves of grain and all that business. Now it's an 18-inch tall, thick stalk, large seed head. Well, it looks very different, and it is very different. And they did many things that so wheat was a problem all throughout human history. I asked this question: what happened to the people who first consumed wild, traditional growing wheat? That's called einkorn wheat, by the way, a 14 chromosome plant that even to this day grows wild in the Middle East. Well, hungry humans, there's people struggle with food availability, right? At times, changes in climate, war, etc. Well, there was a shortage of food, and humans in the Middle East turned to einkorn wheat, wild growing einkorn wheat. You can't eat the plant, right? You can't eat the root, you can't eat the stalk, you can't eat the leaves. You have to take the seed and isolate it, let it dry, pulverize it with stones, and then heat it in a stone bowl over a fire by adding water, and you have porridge. That's how humans first consumed wheat. What happened to those humans who first consumed wild growing einkorn wheat? There was an explosion in tooth decay. Remarkably, prior to the consumption of wheat and grains that occurred about 10 to 12,000 years ago, just at the advent of agriculture. Prior to that, tooth decay was almost unknown. Now think about that. So there's no toothbrushes, there's no fluoride toothpaste, there's no dental floss, there's no dentist, there's no periodontists and orthodontists, and no dental hygiene, except maybe a twig occasionally, but almost no tooth decay. 1 to 3% of all teeth recovered from prior to the adoption of agriculture and wheat and grains. 1 to 3% of all teeth showed evidence of decay, abscess, tooth loss, or misalignment. When humans added wheat, wild growing wheat, 16 to 49% of all teeth recovered showed decay, abscess, misalignment, etc. There was also a marked increase in arthritis and the appearance of deficiencies, especially of iron. And so, the anthropology community has known this for decades, but they weren't telling us that. Did you know that when wild humans first consumed wheat and grains, their health suffered dramatically? Now, that's why all through the ages, it wouldn't be uncommon in the Middle Ages for you to have no teeth at age 20. We compensate by extremes of dental hygiene, right? Floss, brush, periodontists, implants, dentures, right? That's what we compensate by the consumption of wheat, grains, and sugars, by the way. Anyway, So that was original wheat. So original wheat was harmful to people. Wheat of the Bible, emmer, was harmful to people. Traditional strains of wheat, like spelt, also harmful to people. But then agribusiness and those research scientists in Mexico City amplified the toxicity of the wheat plant by making this, it's called high-yield semi-dwarf wheat. One of the things they did was they changed the gliadin. People say gluten, it's the gliadin protein in wheat. Very different today from traditional strains. One of the things they did was they amplified its opiate effects. So you consume gliadin. There's a lot of things in wheat and grains that we can't digest. We're not ruminants, right? If you were a cow or a horse or a goat, you could digest all the factors in grains pretty well because you have microbes in your 4-compartment stomach. we have a single compartment stomach. We don't have the enzymes or the microbes to break down many of the components of wheat and grains. So you consume the gliadin protein of wheat and you can't break it down. If you ate an egg, you would break it down to single amino acids that become your skin and hair and other body parts. You consume the gliadin protein of wheat, you can break it down to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptide fragments, not single amino acids. And those peptide fragments go to your brain and have opioid effects. Doesn't make you high, but it does 2 things. It stimulates appetite dramatically, and it causes addictive eating behavior in people who are susceptible. You'll see it in its most extreme form, for instance, people with binge eating disorder or bulimia. These are the people who are depressed, have low self-esteem, because they sit in front of the refrigerator at 3 o'clock in the morning and binge, right? And then go to the toilet, put their finger down their throat and throw up. It ruins their teeth, it ruins their self-esteem. These people, when they go wheat and grain free, thereby free of gliadin-derived opioid peptides, say, oh, for the first time in 30 years, I no longer obsess about food. I can eat when I'm hungry, which is only occasionally. So it's a dramatic effect in people who are, because susceptibility to these effects varies. So that's the gliadin protein. As Dr. Susan points out, there are other factors. There's wheat germ agglutinin, completely indigestible. It's a protein, and you can't break it down at all. But in its passage from mouth to toilet, it's extremely toxic and inflames your gastrointestinal tract. There's something called phytates. Phytates are responsible for those nutritional deficiencies that appeared in ancient people. So you consume phytates. A typical American consumes about 18 to 19 milligrams per day because you're eating bagels or pizza or whatever. With those phytates bind all positively charged minerals. It binds the iron, zinc, magnesium, calcium, and others. So you have a sandwich, let's say a ham sandwich, and the phytates in that sandwich bind all those minerals, and you pass them out in the toilet. So it's some of the worst iron deficiencies I've ever seen is from phytates. I've seen ladies, it's unique to ladies for some odd reason, who say, I'm getting blood transfusions every 3 months. I'm getting iron injections. They've done a bone marrow biopsy. Nobody can tell me why I'm so anemic all the time. I'm cold. I'm breathless all the time. I'm tired. They go wheat and grain free. They have a normal hemoglobin, no anemia, within about 3 weeks. So it can be very severe. And it worsens deficiencies like magnesium deficiency. And then there's the amylopectin A. That's the carbohydrate unique to wheat and grains that is more digestible than table sugar, because there's an enzyme called amylase in your mouth, in your saliva, and in your stomach that's very good at breaking down the amylopectin A. So if you have, let's say, a ham sandwich on 2 slices of whole wheat bread, your blood sugar goes sky high. So this idea, cut your fat and cholesterol, eat more healthy whole grains, is lethal. That advice is lethal. It causes heart disease. It contributes to cognitive impairment. It contributes to weight gain and abdominal fat. But a lot of those effects are due to the amylopectin A carbohydrate, unique to wheat and grains. And so, and there are other things, but that, in a nutshell, are the problems with this food that we're told should dominate your diet. You're muted, Dr. Susan.
Wow. It also promotes the small LDLs, which are instrumental in leading to atherosclerosis. It also contributes to abdominal fat through the wheat germ glutenate. But basically, what I hear you saying is that, okay, we can eat European grains, or ancient grains, but I guess the message is they're harmful, but less harmful. So we're kidding ourselves when we think we can eat all that delicious French bread.
Yes, I remind people that for the millions of years our species has walked this planet, we've only consumed wheat and grains for a fraction of 1% of our time. So we are not adapted. We don't have the genetic code that causes us to need grains, despite the fact that we're told by dietitians and the USDA and food pyramid, food plan, we're told, oh, you need, there's no such need. This is absolute fiction. There's no such need. And this is why, indigenous populations, like in the Brazilian rainforest or in the east coast of Africa, living in the Tanzanias and other places like Tanzania and Kenya, or the highlands of New Guinea. These are people who live outdoors mostly, who kill animals, fish, shellfish, berries, nuts, roots. They live the way humans have lived for the first several million years we are on this planet. They don't consume grains, and they're perfectly fine. They are prone, they do have infectious diseases and injury, but they don't have diabetes. They don't have ulcerative colitis. No one's got hemorrhoids. There's no constipation. There's no coronary disease. There's no stroke. There's almost no depression. There's almost no schizophrenia. All the things that we are familiar with are largely absent in people who do not consume wheat, grains, and sugar also.
Am I kidding myself by saying, oh, I'm going to eat sourdough bread? It's not as bad.
Well, Dr. Susan, you make an essential point, and that is one of the effects of the amylopectin A of wheat and grains is the formation of small LDL particles. We've got this ridiculous fiction that cholesterol is the cause of heart disease. It is not. Cholesterol is a fat. It's a fat in every cell of your body. Cholesterol can't float freely in the bloodstream because if it did, it would coalesce. Like when you have salad dressing, oil and vinegar, the oil goes to the top, water or vinegar goes to the bottom. The oils coalesce. So if you had free floating cholesterol in your bloodstream, it would coalesce and it would kill you. It would block organs. It would block the capillaries, and you'd have necrosis. You'd have gangrene. You would die. So cholesterol, this fat called cholesterol, a component of every cell in the body, cannot float freely in the bloodstream. It must reside. It must ride on something that's water soluble, aqueous soluble, and those are proteins. So when you have cholesterol and other fats on a particle, it's called a lipoprotein, a fat-carrying protein. So when you consume the amylopectin A of, let's say, a whole grain bagel, your liver converts that amylopectin A to triglycerides, fats. The triglycerides are released into the bloodstream, but they can't float freely, right? Because they're fats like cholesterol. So the liver packages them on a lipoprotein. That's called very low density lipoprotein, VLDL. And those VLDL particles, rich in triglycerides, interact with LDL particles, and they go through a series of reactions and they make them small. You eat that bagel and you form VLDL, then small LDL. Small LDL is really weird. So if you had large normal LDL particles you got from eating butter or some pork fat, your liver recognized that large LDL because the recognition protein, apoprotein B, is exposed. Liver clears it 24 hours. You eat that bagel or a whole wheat sandwich or pasta, your liver converts the amylopectin A into triglycerides, VLDL, and small LDL. The small LDL is not recognized by your liver because the apoprotein B is concealed. And the small LDL particle floats around and around and around in your bloodstream for 5 to 7 days, giving it much greater opportunity to interact with the walls of arteries and cause atherosclerosis, stuff that leads to heart attacks and sudden cardiac death. And that small LDL is much more prone to oxidation and to glycation. So it's a double whammy. High blood glucose from consumption of grains glycates the small LDL particle. Now that glycoxidized LDL particle that's long-lived, is able to get into the walls of arteries where it provokes an inflammatory response. That's how heart disease is caused. It has nothing to do with cholesterol. Cholesterol is about making money for the pharmaceutical industry. Has not. That's why, over 80 million Americans take statin cholesterol drugs, but there's been no meaningful reduction in heart disease. And your cardiologist is making tons of money. They added a $50 million heart wing to your hospital because that's what makes number one moneymaker. Why would they want to turn off the number one moneymaker for the healthcare system by telling you how not to have heart disease? That's the tragedy here, that by focusing on idiocy like cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, statin drugs, low fat, cut your center, by putting all your attention and the attention of most of our colleagues, Susan, not my colleagues, on those things, it took their attention off the real causes of heart disease. That's why there's been no impact on it. But the truth is, we all have magnificent control over risk for heart disease, but it doesn't come from addressing cholesterol. It starts with eliminating the amylopectin A of wheat and grains and sugars that promotes the formation of VLDL and small LDL particles. There's more you can do, but that's a really powerful start. Think about this. The common advice to cut your fat and cholesterol, saturated fat, and eat more healthy whole grains and everything in moderation, all the nonsense we hear, causes heart disease. Yet preventing, even regressing or reversing heart disease is very easy to accomplish.
So I guess the answer is no, I can't continue my sourdough bread.
So it still has amylopectin A, of course. It still has wheat germ agglutinin. It still has gliadin that forms opioid peptides and stimulates appetite. And well, it's fermented. So people say it must have good microbes. No, you baked it and killed them. So no.
Well, we're all going to want to know your recommendations. So, like, what do you think about eating fat? And I think you just answered that, that heart disease is not a cholesterol deficiency. So, what do you think about fat consumption?
I think you should use butter. I think you should buy some pork and don't buy lean cuts. Eat the fat. I think you should have more bacon and sausage, sausage preferably with that are in natural casings, intestines, because they're rich in collagen. If you have chicken, you should eat the skin, you should eat the liver, you should eat the dark meat, you should save the remains, the carcass, and boil it for nutrients like collagen. But please don't hear make bone broth. It's become clear that the methods used to make bone broth, that is prolonged boiling, like 36 hours in the presence of vinegar to encourage extraction of minerals, also causes toxic levels of lead to be released into the bone broth. So we don't do bone broth. We do, it doesn't sound nice, but carcass broth. That leftover baked chicken, for instance, it's got some meat and some ligaments and tendons, maybe a little bit of the organs and the bones. Boil only for maybe 4 hours. Don't add vinegar. And have a beautiful soup, right? Throw the bones away. Now you have carcass broth or carcass soup. Doesn't sound good, but that's much safer for you, and you're still getting some collagen. I'd like to say, of course, eat more intestines and stomach and heart and tongue, but most people just won't do that. So we rely on these workarounds: collagen peptides, hyaluronic acid, etc.
What about for vegetarians?
Well, so vegetarians, there is no good solution. And I'm sorry, you're going to experience accelerated skin aging, accelerated joint destruction, accelerated arterial aging, and because there's no plant source of collagen. There's no plant source of hyaluronic acid. There are some online conversations that say that's nonsense. These are all animal sources. They don't come from plants. So, by the way, this argument like that plant, vegan or vegetarian diets are more heart healthy is absolute nonsense. So there was a recent study called the Stanford Twin Study, and they made a Netflix documentary about it called You Are What You Eat. They took 22 identical twins, one put on a healthy omnivorous diet, which we'd argue about that, and the other one on a vegan diet, and then compared various measures over, I believe, 2 months. And the vegans reduce their LDL cholesterol. Now, you have to know LDL cholesterol is an absolute fiction. It's not a real number. It's a calculated number, and it's extremely unreliable, and it's a very poor, almost useless predictor of heart disease. There are good markers, but it's not LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol, however, makes a lot of money for the pharmaceutical industry. So in this study, they tracked LDL cholesterol, and there's a 15 milligram reduction in LDL cholesterol. Conclusion of the researchers, because there was a 15-point drop in LDL cholesterol, being a vegan diet is heart healthy, improves heart health. They did not show that. That's a misinterpretation. All they showed was this flawed calculated marker, not measured, calculated marker, was reduced by the and by the way, the fiber intake in the omnivorous diet was so poor. So there were all kinds of problems with that study. Yet it made headlines, and people say, vegan diet is heart healthy. A vegan diet is destructive to health. There is no evidence. People say, but the studies show us that vegan diets are healthy. They do not show that. That's a misinterpretation. Over and over again, Dr. Susan, you know this, that people misinterpret evidence. We have, for instance, Harvard School of Public Health. Frank Sachs, Frank Hugh, and others did this. They say, Jane, what did you eat for breakfast on Monday? She says, I had a bowl of organic oatmeal and skim milk and a banana. What'd you have for lunch? I was at the office. I ate a bologna sandwich with mustard, and I had a side of cottage cheese. What'd you have for dinner? She tells, right? And we do that over 5 days. I contact you 10 years later and ask about your health. Did you have colon cancer? Did you have heart disease? What happened, right? How much weight did you gain, right? Well, in those 10 years, so 5 days of a diet questionnaire, 10 years, you got divorced. You drank too much. You binge drank. You went on a all-you-can-eat expense-paid vacation in Mexico. You had trouble with some teenagers. All the ups and downs. You gained 30 pounds. Then you lost 20 pounds. Then you did a cleanse in that 10-year period. But they say the diet you ate, that bologna you had on Tuesday for lunch, is the cause for heart disease. Those studies, epidemiologic observational studies, are absolute garbage. Yet they're used as the basis for dietary guidelines in such things as the American Heart Association diet. So we have this flood, this ocean of misinterpretation, misinformation. But this is why you hear this. Eating red meat causes colon cancer. 4 weeks later, eating red meat doesn't cause colon cancer. Eating eggs causes heart disease. 2 months later, eating eggs doesn't cause. Well, which one? This whipsaw, it's because they're generating garbage data by asking people what they ate 10 years ago. So we got to start from scratch in a lot of ways. But I would say the evidence to suggest that reducing fat or saturated fat that reduces cardiovascular disease is garbage. There is no such evidence. It was misinterpretation and even, in many cases, misrepresentation.
Well, I want to get to your final recommendations for everybody, but first I want to answer some of the audience's questions. I will intermix the hands that are raised with the things that are in the chat. So Joanna, please ask your question.
Yes, I actually have a couple of real brief questions. One is, you talked about SIBO and also CFO, the fungal, but what about methane SIBO? Does the SIBO yogurt work for that?
So what Joanna is asking, of course, is there's another form of overgrowth called intestinal methanogen overgrowth. And these are microbes like Methanobrevibacter smithii. Now so that can be responsible mostly for constipation. So most people who have methanogen overgrowth suffer with constipation. Now here's something to be aware of. If we were to look at the microbiomes, stool microbiomes of, let's say, the Hadza in Tanzania, or the Maasai in Kenya, or the Yanomami in the Brazilian or Venezuelan rainforest, or the jungles of New Guinea, hunter-gatherers, they have more methanogens than we do, but they don't have any constipation. So based on that simple observation, Joanna, I would say, I'm not so sure there's such a thing. What I think is happening is it matters in what setting or context methanogen overgrowth occurs. If it occurs in people who have healthy microbiomes, like those hunter-gatherer people, there's no constipation, there's no problem. If it occurs in people who have a disrupted microbiome, then you get constipation and perhaps other issues. It's not quite clear how far-reaching the effects of methanogens are. So my solution, I think, until the science better evolves, is address the entire microbiome. Do general things. Make our SIBO yogurt maybe, or at least replace Lactobacillus reuteri. We haven't talked about fermented foods like kimchi and kombucha and veggies ferment on your kitchen counter and kefirs. Those are so important. I would do those things and not try to specifically target. So when you get involved in the microbiome, we have to get rid of this mindset that came from the antibiotic era. If you got this microbe, take that antibiotic, right? If you got E. coli bladder infection, take this antibiotic. If you got pneumococcal pneumonia, take this antibiotic. When we get into the microbiome, we have to get rid of that idea. There are exceptions where you have to do that. But most of the time, what we're really doing is reestablishing the entire microbiome environment. And we do that by restoring those important lost microbes like reuteri, getting lots and lots of fermented foods, including plant fibers like root vegetables and legumes and onions and shallots in our diet. And I think that's what I would do. Only if you have a real problem should you embark on a process to actually eradicate or reduce methanogens. And that's uncertain how you do that. There's the antibiotic Xifaxan, when combined with neomycin, can do that. There's an herbal regimen called Candibactin A or Candibactin BR that can do that. I don't think we could say that the SIBO yogurt does that unless it's part of a broader effort. So until we know better, Joanna, I would say adopt a comprehensive program to restore the entire microbiome.
There are a number of people who say that if you have SIBO, you shouldn't eat fermented foods. And also I've heard that if you have high histamines, you shouldn't eat fermented foods. What's your stance on that?
So there's a lot of misinterpretation, Joanna. So people who have SIBO are often intolerant to histamine-containing foods like cheese or wine. They're often intolerant to FODMAPs foods like fibers and sugars. They're often intolerant to eggs, nuts, to nightshades like eggplants and tomatoes. These are all SIBO. And if you consume fermented foods, you can get sick. If you consume prebiotic fiber, you can get sick. But it's not the food. It's you have uncorrected SIBO. So the point, this is how we do it. You can reduce the foods that bother you. Let's say eggplants and eggs, let's just say, but correct the SIBO. And you're going to find almost always, within about 4 weeks, depending on the severity of the SIBO, you can eat those foods. The intolerance goes away. There never was anything wrong with the foods. It was the SIBO that was making you intolerant. So I point this out. People say, well, I reduced my histamine-containing foods and I feel a little better. Yeah, but you still got SIBO and you're exposed to multiple. So what if you don't correct your SIBO and then 5 years later you develop multiple sclerosis, or you find yourself with Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's dementia or type 2 diabetes or increasing abdominal visceral fat or rosacea or psoriasis or depression or suicidal thoughts or Hashimoto's thyroiditis or coronary disease or atrial fibrillation. You see how big this is? And so these people who say, oh, don't eat those foods, they just don't understand what's going on, Joanne. It's simple as that. You don't want to ignore the SIBO. You got to address the SIBO.
And I'm assuming, kind of along with Dr. Susan's question about sourdough, I'm assuming that probably it's not great to eat even some of the better gluten-free breads.
So gluten-free breads will destroy your health because they're made with cornstarch, tapioca starch, potato flour, and and cornstarch. There's four principal ingredients. So very few foods raise blood glucose, cause weight gain, and small LDL. Very few foods do worse than wheat. What foods are worse than wheat for raising blood glucose, small LDL, etc.? Cornstarch, tapioca starch, potato flour, and rice flour. Gluten-free flours. Once again, when I was dealing with a food company some years back, I had to talk to food scientists. Now, wouldn't you think that food scientists are scientists of food? They're not. Food scientists who work in food production are scientists of food production. So if you say, how can I make sure that when I fill this plastic bag with 6 ounces of some product, it's always 6 ounces? Well, they know how to make sure the filter doesn't clog. That's what food scientists do. They know nothing about nutrition. So you'll see food companies like gluten-free food companies producing essentially lethal foods like gluten-free bread, gluten-free baking mixes that actually, so people said this to me years ago. They say, I did Wheat Belly. I gained 30 pounds. Now I'm a type 2 diabetic. I say, are you eating gluten-free foods? Well, yeah. I said, well, you didn't read the book. You maybe read the cover. Because I made clear in the original book, do not eat gluten-free processed food. Now, if it's an avocado that's naturally gluten-free, oh, of course. But so Joanna, time and again, when food manufacturers get in the act, it's not because they're evil. Sometimes they are, but it's because they're ignorant or don't care to know better. So that's why you can't ask a dietitian. You can't ask the doctor, unless you have an enlightened doctor like Dr. Susan, which is rare, right? But most of the time you have to rely on your own wits and knowledge.
Do you have any
Thank
more
you.
questions, Joanna?
No, this is
Okay.
great. Thank you so
We have
much.
questions on rice, which I imagine is a risk for arsenic and its high glycemic index. But what about rice or white rice cooked with coconut oil? Does that help reduce the glycemic load? Is it healthy? What do you recommend concerning rice?
So the toxicity of grains is a spectrum. Most toxic, modern, high-yield semi-dwarf wheat. And then we have rye and barley and sorghum and millet, blah, blah, blah. And at the most benign, not benign, but the least harmful end is rice in all its forms, wild, brown, etc. But as Dr. Susan points out, it is almost entirely sugar. So it's almost pure sugar, about 90% sugar. So we got problems with the sugar. So it rots your teeth, causes small LDL particles, even in small quantities. And as Dr. Susan points out, we now know it's also a source of arsenic. Now, the USDA, that is the government agency that protects the agribusiness industry, not the public, the agribusiness industry. They say, oh, don't get too upset about the arsenic issue. We don't know how toxic it is, but they did ask like rice milk manufacturers to stop, especially pushing them on children, because the arsenic is very toxic to children. So there's arsenic, but there's also the amylopectin A carbohydrate that acts like sugar in rice. But rice has very little protein, so it doesn't have the wheat germ agglutinin. It does have wheat germ agglutinin, but in very small quantities. It doesn't have the gliadin protein, doesn't have a lot of the other toxic proteins of wheat. So it's at the more benign end, but it's not benign. It would be like saying, why don't you have some sugar? Why don't you have some candy bars? It's not that healthy. People say, well, why are people in Asia skinny? Well, because they were on the brink of starvation for many decades. And starvation blunts some of the effects of carbohydrate excess. And now, of course, there are more obese and more diabetics, type 2 diabetics in China than there are in the US. So it's not like they're impervious.
Does organic rice, if it's rinsed and cooked with coconut oil, would that mitigate most of these concerns?
So people follow this fiction that if they eat something with a high glycemic index, like rice, and combine it with other foods, it might be a fiber, it could be an oil like coconut oil, it could be vegetables, that it's now harmless. That is not true. So let's say, for instance, let's say you had a bowl of rice and your blood glucose at the start, before you started eating, was 100. You eat the bowl of rice, and 30 to 60 minutes after starting it, where the peak blood glucose, let's say it's 173, okay? Now you do it again, another day, you have the rice, this time with coconut oil or some other food. Starting glucose 100, glucose now 148. So it's less high, but still too high. I have a little rule I follow. It's called the blood glucose no change rule. If you want to lose abdominal visceral fat, or if you're a type 2 diabetic and want to become a non-diabetic, or you want to stop glycating proteins, what all that means is when blood glucose goes above 100, you glycate proteins, you glucose modified proteins. If you glycate proteins in the lenses of your eyes, you get cataracts. If you glycate the collagen in your skin, you get accelerated skin aging. If you glycate the collagen in your joints, you get breakdown of brittle cartilage, bone-on-bone arthritis. So glycation is not a good thing. So every time your blood glucose goes above 100, you are glycating and you're accelerating all the phenomena of aging and disease. So check a blood glucose prior to eating. An ideal blood glucose is 60 to 90 milligrams. And then check another blood glucose or a continuous glucose monitor if you have access to one. And then check another blood glucose 30 to 60 minutes after the start of a meal. People say, oh, but my doctor said check it 2 hours. Why are you saying 30? Well, that's advice for people on insulin and drugs to see if their blood glucose returns to baseline. That's not what we're asking. We're asking, what is the rise? What's the peak blood glucose? And that occurs about 30 to 60 minutes after the start of the meal. And so we try to aim for no change. If you start at 100, we want no higher than 100. If you start at 140, we want no higher than 140. If you start at 70, we want no higher, accepting that the error in these devices, they're not perfect, are about plus or minus 10. So if you go from, say, 92 to 102, that's no change, okay? We aim for no change. What happens when you repeatedly do that? So let's say you do get a high rise. You go from 100 to 143. Look at your meal, find the culprit. It'll be some of the carbohydrates or sugars. Either cut back on portion size or eliminate it. You do this repeatedly, no change, no change, no change, for a few weeks. You don't have to do it forever. Abdominal fat shrinks, triglycerides go down, type 2 diabetics often become non-diabetics. Now think about that. The device given to you to manage your diabetes is also a device that helps you become a non-diabetic. But most doctors don't tell you that. So you had a tool. You were given a tool that reverses a disease, but weren't told.
Wow. Okay, folks, raise your hands if you've got questions. In the chat, we have a question about powder fiber products.
I think what that person is referring to is powdered prebiotic fiber products like inulin or galacto-oligosaccharides or pectin or glucomannan. These are fine. So these are fibers. Let's talk about that. So there are fibers that are metabolized by microbes and it causes them to proliferate and produce metabolites beneficial to you. So a very popular one is inulin or fructo-oligosaccharides. We should get these mostly from foods, from root vegetables like jicama, onions, garlic, shallots, leeks, other root vegetables, legumes, red beans, black beans, white beans, chickpeas, hummus. So these are the things that nourish microbes. You can't digest those fibers, but microbes can, and it does good things for those microbes. Your primary source should be food, but you can use processed manufactured powders like inulin FOS to augment your intake. I would never rely exclusively on those products because you're always better off with whole foods, not a highly processed isolate of food, but you can use those to augment. You're making a smoothie, say, right? And you can add maybe a teaspoon of inulin or galacto-oligosaccharides or pectin, whatever, but rely mostly on foods. Use those products only to supplement what you're doing with your fibers.
Okay, Sheridan.
Hi there. I'm wondering, can you make your yogurts with non-dairy like coconut milk or coconut fat instead if you have a problem with dairy?
Yeah, you can make it with coconut milk, but not with the coconut fat because microbes need sugars or carbohydrates.
Mhm.
So what we do to make the yogurts and dairy products is I like to start with organic half and half because I reject this idea that fat is bad. And fat, in fact, in dairy is the healthiest component of all, ironically.
Right.
So I start with organic half and half. I add a tablespoon or so of inulin or raw potato starch. It's kind of like you have your garden in the backyard, your 10 by 10 plot, and you throw cow manure on the garden. Well, you're going to have more and bigger tomatoes and cucumbers, right? Same thing here. We're going to feed those microbes with a tablespoon or so of inulin or raw potato starch, which is a glucose polymer fiber, and we get more microbes. We get about a 4-fold increase in microbial count. I'm sorry, what was the question again?
So we're talking about the difference between
not dairy.
creating your routier. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, is there any different processes or ingredients that you would add um, because of, because it's different. It doesn't have the milk sugars. And so I'm wondering, what the difference is, or if you can do it at all.
The problem with using coconut, that is canned coconut milk, the carton is too thin, it has too many additives in it.
Right.
So
No, you want pure. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You want canned coconut milk with no additives, no gelatin gum,
Right.
no xanthan gum, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
What we do is this. So it's similar to dairy, but a few added steps, because the problem with coconut milk is it likes to separate into fat and solids.
Right.
We're going to take steps to prevent that. We first heat it to about 180 degrees, only because there's a rare contaminant that's dangerous. It's rare, but it does happen once in a while. So we heat it to 180 for a couple of minutes, allow it to cool to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we add guar gum. So it's an additive, but it's a very benign fiber additive. We add about 3/4 of a teaspoon to a teaspoon of guar gum. We add our either a prebiotic fiber or sucrose. You can add sucrose. Microbes like sucrose also, like a tablespoon. And then we add our microbe, and then stir lightly. And then we, like the dairy, we ferment. So there's two different steps. We preheat, we add guar gum. And there's some variation on this, but that's essentially it. This recipe is in my Super Gut book. It's also in my drdavesinfinitehealth.com. It's in there also. The other milks, like almond milk, not the best because there's not a whole lot in it. It's almost all water, right?
Right.
But you can also ferment other things. You can ferment salsa and hummus and pico de gallo, and there's all kinds of things you can ferment. What I don't know often is what kind of counts you get. We did perform flow cytometry on coconut milk yogurt and got roughly the equivalent numbers, about 330 billion per half cup serving of the coconut. I was skeptical that coconut milk would yield the same numbers, but it does.
So is it the same consistency or, do you get, then do you use the same? So if like traditionally, if you do yogurt, you just save a starter and then use the starter, or do you have to start all over again? How does that work?
No, in all these projects, you only need a microbe source, like a starter culture or a probiotic. You only need it for the first time. And then, as you point out, you can make future batches with a little bit of the prior batch. The only uncertainty we have with that, so if you're making roti yogurt, whether it's coconut milk or dairy, you make the yogurt. And by the way, the first batch will often separate into curds and whey. That's just, we call that the first batch effect. But then you make the next batch from a little bit of the prior batch, curds or whey, or in coconut milk, whatever. And then you make the next batch. The only time we're not sure what happens is when you're using a polymicrobial fermentation, like the SIBO yogurt, where we're getting Reuteri, Gasseri, and Bacillus coagulans. Let's say you're on your 7th batch. What's the mix of microbes now? We don't know. We've not performed DNA analyses. So what I'm telling people is, if you're going to consume the SIBO yogurt for a long time, like months or years, every so often re-inoculate or start from scratch, because we don't know. It's like a garden. If you grew tomatoes and zucchini and cucumbers and squash, anybody who gardens will say the zucchini is going to take over the entire garden at some point, where it's very competitive. Microbes are the same way. So we don't know what happens to the microbial composition several batches in. So that's the only time we're uncertain.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We have a question about allulose for GLP activation.
I don't know anything about allulose and GLP, but allulose is our preferred sweetener because there's good evidence. One, does not stimulate insulin or blood glucose. It has minimal prebiotic fiber effect. I was hoping it was going to be a prebiotic fiber, but it's not really. Very few microbes can consume allulose. But interestingly, it does, I'm not sure if this is a GLP-1 mediated effect, but there is a reduction in subcutaneous fat. So allulose it's our preferred sweetener. Monk fruit's an excellent sweetener also. Stevia is an excellent sweetener, putting aside some of the aftertaste issues. We still use erythritol, though we don't go wild with it, just because of the questions raised by Stan Hazen's study, where he did a study that showed that maybe erythritol causes platelet clumping. I'm skeptical of anything that comes out of that laboratory because they produce, I think, suspect information. Those are the people who said, if you consume anything from animals, you get TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, that is related to cardiovascular risk. Well, the mistake they made, I believe, is they give people chicken, pork, fish, whatever, here, and TMAO comes out as a metabolite. But they used the microbiome as a black box. They ignored what the microbiome's contribution was. And I can tell you that there's good evidence that it's fecal microbes, proteobacteria, and Bacteroides. Those are the microbes that produce the TMAO. I don't think it's the food. It's the disruption of the microbiome that causes the TMAO. But anyway, that group also did a study that suggested that erythritol may cause platelet clumping, that is, blood clotting. Now, wait a minute here. Erythritol is a natural sugar in apples and pears. You're telling me apples and pears cause blood clotting? And so I'm kind of skeptical this is true, but nonetheless, we still include some erythritol as one of our sweeteners.
One person has a question about taking vitamin K2, which probably should be taken with vitamin D when vitamin D is taken.
So the evidence of K2 as a way to prevent bone loss of bone, not bone density. So one of the problems we have in tracking risk for osteopenia, osteoporosis is bone density is a very flawed measure because bone density only reflects hydroxyapatite, the hard mineral content. It does not measure, for instance, collagen content of bone. K2 is probably something that adds to bone strength, but doesn't really track well with bone density. So there's a bit of a difficulty with K2. There was a suspicion initially that K2 reduced cardiovascular risk. That's probably not true. That argument is falling apart. There's still an ongoing study that would finally answer that question, I believe. But here, I will point this out. So the microbes in your GI tract, normal microbes, are supposed to produce vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B7, B9, B12, and K2. So a lack of those things, the apparent benefits, say, of taking niacin or thiamine or riboflavin or even K2, I think what we're really doing is a workaround for the deficiencies created by dysbiose, disrupted bowel flora. It's kind of like it's kind of like the hyaluronic acid, right? It's something we're lacking, and taking it is beneficial. But the real solution, I think, is to correct your microbiome and allow the microbes in your GI tract to produce those nutrients. A lot of the bacillus species produce K2. Now, here's something. Homocysteine, an increased level of homocysteine, has been a topic of hot debate for many years because we know that people with higher homocysteine blood levels, particularly 14 micromolar or higher, have increased risk for cardiovascular events, cancer, depression, and other problems. Well, we now have 8 clinical trials in which people were given either a collection of B vitamins, typically B6, B9, folate, B12, sometimes B2, riboflavin, versus placebo. And homocysteine was reduced by a mean of about 25%, but there was no improvement in health, no reduction in cardiovascular events or other measures. So why would this marker be such a powerful predictor of health problems? We reduce it and nothing good comes of it. Well, what if homocysteine is really a marker for dysbiosis and SIBO, and thereby the failure to produce internally B2, B6, B9, and B12? That study's not yet been done. I probably won't perform that one, but you can see what's happening here. Insights in the microbiome is changing our thinking in so many ways. Gout, high uric acid, hyperuricemia, is a problem of the microbiome, a loss of uric acid consuming species. Calcium oxalate kidney stones is a problem in which people have lost oxalate consuming species, especially oxalobacter and various lactobacillus species. And so once again, do you really need to take K2, or is it really a failure of your microbe to produce? Now, that all said, there's no harm in taking K2. It's benign, 180 micrograms of the MK7 form. Or, by the way, ferment things with Bacillus subtilis, subspecies natto. If you can eat natto, I give you credit, because natto is disgusting for most Americans. My mom was Japanese and she fed us natto. We couldn't. I've eaten a lot of crazy things over the years. I could not eat natto. It looks like snot. But you can always make natto or ferment other things. I know some people like to ferment, for instance, chickpeas with Bacillus subtilis, and you get a load of K2 that way.
Hey, Sheridan, another question.
So this is a little bit of a wild card, but since we're talking about the microbiome, what can you, or do you have any information about FUT2 SNPs and how that actually plays into this also, with it affects your secretor status and all kinds of other things. So I'm just kind of wondering, is there any information that you've run across where specific species in your yogurt does anything to support that?
I'm not sure I follow that. So you're asking about a specific SNP?
Yeah, it's a SNP. It's in the gut. It has to do with antigen secretion on the mucin layer. So I'm wondering, is there any evidence or indicator in any of these particular strains that you're working with that has any sort of beneficial effect on that aspect of your microbiome? Because I know it does affect different types of B vitamins and your ability to manufacture that, and also you know, other disease processes actually. And then the bifidobacter in the microbiome are also decreased because you don't have the proper milk oligosaccharides in the mother to feed the baby. So,
So I know nothing about this secreting SNP. Don't know anything about that. So sorry. Don't know anything.
It's
But you
okay.
do, but you do raise a very, one of the most neglected areas is the child's microbiome and maternal microbiomes at time of pregnancy and delivery. I'm not a gynecologist, but I do think about that a lot, because I've had my daughter-in-law has delivered 2 children recently. Quick story. So she has no shortage of resources. Her grandfather's very wealthy. And so when she goes to these hospitals, she gets the red carpet because her grandfather, for instance, donated $40 million to a major hospital. So she, VIP, right? And she gets the lousiest care you can possibly imagine, because she gets this figurehead who knows nothing, the chief of rheumatology, chief of gastroenterology. But I was shocked at how little empowering information was given, like the issue you point out, and that is Bifidobacteria infantis is a microbe lost by most modern mothers. And if the mom doesn't have it, she can't pass it on to the child through breast milk or through the passage through the birth canal. And that child now can't metabolize, as you point out, human milk oligosaccharides. So that's a really interesting thing to do. What I've been having people do. So the company that makes this commercial probiotic is called Evivo, EVIVO. They make this strain. I think it's Bifidobacteria infantis 001. They say, take this microbe, mix it with breast milk, feed it to your baby. I say, no. Yeah, you can do that. Yeah. But how about if mom makes yogurt with it during pregnancy and repopulates her breast and vagina and rest of her body with Bifidobacteria infantis, so that the baby receives the microbe in the context of the entire microbiome? I think that's probably a healthier way to give your child Bifidobacteria infantis, because the evidence is quite good. There's a group in UC Davis University of California, Davis, that's generated a lot of supportive data around this microbe. So when children have Bifidobacteria infantis and are breastfed and thereby obtain human milk oligosaccharides, they have better neurological maturation. They have less asthma, they're less prone to diabetes, and both type 1 and type 2, less likely to become obese, and they have a higher IQ. So such a crucial issue. And no one's, to my knowledge, almost nobody's telling pregnant moms this. And there's some other issues too, but that's such a big issue. And I made sure my daughter-in-law, for instance, was doing this. And for all it's worth, she's got a beautiful, healthy baby.
Yeah, that along with C-section, we won't even talk about that. So
And Sheridan, what was that SNP again?
it is the FUT2, FUT2.
Okay, because we
And
had a
just
question about that in the chat.
yeah, for anybody else who has that SNP, I know that there is a human milk oligosaccharide product called Holigos, HOLLIGOS, that is a feeder. So thanks.
Okay. Joanna,
Yes, I wanted to ask you more about oxalates. I was under the impression that the oxalate consuming bacteria in the microbiome was very difficult to replace. And I also understand that candida overgrowth can produce oxalates. What are your suggestions if a person is high oxalate for helping to reverse that?
You know, while the evidence is very clear on which microbes consume uric acid as another example of a metabolic disease, it's not entirely worked out yet which microbes are best. One of the things that has to be factored in are what are called consortium or guild effects. That is, microbes are just like humans, right? You don't live in isolation. You have a partner, you have a family, you have neighbors, coworkers, right? People in your community. Microbes are the same. They collaborate. They collaborate via metabolites. And this is a big hole in our knowledge. So one of the problems we have, for instance, if your mom gave you Lactobacillus reuteri, right, by passage through the birth canal or breastfeeding or contact, you would likely have that microbe reuteri for a lifetime, barring exposure to antibiotics, etc. Same thing here. There's probably a guild or consortium of collaborative microbes. And maybe it includes Oxalobacter formigenes. Maybe it includes various strains of Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. But right now, it's not quite clear what that collection of microbes is. But I'm confident that probably within the next, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, we're going to say, okay, Joanna, if you have high oxalate, you have calcium oxalate kidney stones, get these 3 microbes. They collaborate to reduce oxalates, but right now that's not entirely clear.
woman had a question about vitamins. You'd be an expert, but my sense is it's individual. Some people can't tolerate, the people say, take glutathione, take green tea, take curcumin. Not everybody can tolerate it. I mean, like if you have difficulties genetically with sulfur, you got to approach it gingerly. So one size fits all doesn't sound good. But Dr. Davis, you might have some ideas on that.
You know, I've taken kind of a simplistic view of all this. I've tried to make sure people are addressing the nutrients that are lacking in modern life because of modern habits. For instance, we all have to filter our drinking water, right? We can't go to the nearby stream or river to drink. It's got sewage and other things in it. So we rely on water filtration, whether the city does it for you or you do it on your kitchen counter or whatever. All those methods are very good at removing all magnesium. And of course, modern produce, vegetables and fruit has very little magnesium because of modern farming methods, about 80 to 90% less magnesium than it used to. So one of the things we talk is magnesium because you need it for bone density and heart rhythm and blood pressure. Another thing is vitamin D, of course, because we live indoors. We are polite people, law-abiding citizens, and wear clothes in public. And so we have to get vitamin D. And iodine, a lot of people have forgotten that iodine deficiency was a huge public health problem all throughout history, all throughout the world until 1924, when it became clear that goiters and large thyroid glands due to lack of iodine could be remedied by adding iodine. Well, in 1924, in the US, the FDA said, how do we get this uneducated population, this illiterate population? And back then, 25% of the population was illiterate. So they started a poster campaign. There's no internet, no radio, no TV, right? So they started a poster campaign. Use more iodized salt. They asked salt makers to add iodine to their salt. Use more iodized salt. Keep your family goiter-free. And so goiters went away. This crippling, terrible health problem called goiters and the deaths. If your great-grandma was still around, you say, great-grandma, tell me about goiters. She would say, Susan, you wouldn't believe it. My next door neighbor died of heart failure from her goiter. Kids in school had large goiters and they sometimes wouldn't come to school because they died. It was a big problem. We forgot. Well, the FDA told us to use more iodized salt. Then they thought that there was overuse of salt. They misinterpreted some events that occurred and they said, stop using salt. Guess what's coming back? Goiters and hypothyroidism. So I address nutrients largely lacking. Now, I also caution people to be careful about what nutrients mean. Well, so it's one thing to replace nutrients that are essential, whose need is programmed in your genetic code, right? Like vitamin D, you need it. It's not a choice. You need it. Magnesium, you need it. If you don't get it, bad things happen. But when you introduce exogenous things that are unfamiliar to your genetics and your physiology, weird stuff happens. So, for instance, people say, take berberine, right? Because it reduces blood glucose and blood pressure. Now, wait a minute. You take berberine, you poop out almost all of it. So how can it have any kind of benefit if you poop it all out, right? Likewise, curcumin. You take 100 milligrams of curcumin, you poop out 99 milligrams. Yet we know C-reactive protein, that inflammatory measure, goes down. We know that if you have knee arthritis, pain can be, well, how? If there's almost no absorption. So you see people saying things like, oh, we're going to do nanoparticle emulsions and add piperine and black pepper to force absorption, even though it's never been shown that those actually exert further benefit. I would propose that the reasons those things work is because they're active in the bowel flora and the intestinal barrier. Curcumin, for instance, is known to increase intestinal mucus and improve the intestinal barrier against microbes. So many of us have screwed up our microbiomes. We've allowed specifically fecal microbes. Isn't that nice? Fecal microbes like E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter, which this might be a familiar list because those are the same organisms that cause food poisoning. That kid flipping burgers at the fast food joint who went number 2 and didn't wash his hands, then touched your food, and you get sick from fecal. So fecal organisms can make us sick if they're outside of the colon where they belong.
Dr. Davis, would you be able to summarize what we can do to protect our gut, make it better, et cetera? Because you've got so many suggestions in your book, because I want the audience to benefit from them.
So sure, Dr. Susan. So to try to make this simple, what I tell people is think about your backyard garden in springtime. How do you grow a garden? Well, you go out, you lay out a plot, let's say 10 by 10, right? You pick out the rocks and the twigs. You plant seeds, right, for tomatoes and cucumbers, etc. And then you water and fertilize your garden through the growing season, and then you harvest your vegetables at the end. Your microbiome is the same. Your gastrointestinal microbiome is much the same. We're going to prepare the soil. What does that mean? Well, go through the list of things that disrupt the microbiome. That's in my Super Gut book. You can get it, my Dr. Davis Infant Health, and other places. But it means things like get off stomach acid blocking drugs, get off non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, filter your water to get rid of the chlorine and fluoride, avoid emulsifying agents in your foods like ice cream and salad dressings. It doesn't mean you can't have ice cream or salad dressings. It means you have to find brands that don't have, say, carboxymethylcellulose or make it yourself. Minimize your exposure to antibiotics. Sometimes you really need to take an antibiotic, but a lot of times antibiotics are given to you just because, right? You have an upper respiratory viral infection, they give you an antibiotic. Well, you should question that, right? So there's a list of things we do to prepare the soil. Then we plant the seeds. The seeds would be things like Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, keystone species that are foundational, support other microbes. It's getting most important thing you can probably do is eat fermented foods, kefirs, real yogurt, not the garbage in the grocery store. Ferment it yourself using extended fermentation. Kombuchas, veggies. People say, "Oh, it's too expensive." No, slice up some cucumbers. If you don't know how to ferment, Super Gut, there's lots of resources. My friend Donna Schwank is very prolific in this. I think her website's called Cultured Food Life, and she provides tons of free recipes how to ferment veggies. You need filtered water because you don't want chlorine or fluoride in it, right? You want non-iodized salt because iodine is an antimicrobial. to make a brine. And you take veggies, like sliced cucumbers, say, maybe throw in a sprig of rosemary and other herbs. You want to either fill the jar so high that there's no air water interface, or use a mechanism to keep it down. A plate with a stone on top, or I use a glass in the mouth of a jar to push it down, because you want anaerobic fermentation. You want fermentation without oxygen. And then leave it on your kitchen counter covered for, depending on the mix of veggies, anywhere from several days to several weeks to several months. Depends on the mix. That's why it's helpful to have some recipes. If you're going to ferment tomatoes, for instance, you'll have fermented tomatoes within 3 days. Oh, I should tell you about, just because it's so wonderful, my sparkling juices, my Saccharomyces boulardii sparkling juices. If you ferment, for instance, apple cider, you get apple soda. If you ferment mango juice, you get mango soda. Now, we don't want juices in general, right? Too sugary. But if you ferment them long enough, there's no sugar. So we're going to get Saccharomyces boulardii. It's a fungus. You can buy it as a commercial product like Floristore, Target, Walgreens, Walmart. So Floristore, 1 capsule Floristore, empty into any volume of juice. Just make sure the juice has no preservatives, no potassium sorbate, no sodium benzoate, none of that stuff, because they kill the microbes, right? So empty your Floristore into your juice, any volume. Cap it lightly, because at 24 hours, you're going to see it bubbling. That's carbon dioxide. You may have to vent it every now and then, because if you don't, it might explode. Literally, let it go. I can let it go for about 60 hours. And that allows all the sugars to be fermented out and converted to carbon dioxide and other metabolites. And then refrigerate to stop the process. And then drink. We drink a quarter or a half cup a day, once or several times a day. Several times a day if you're taking antibiotics. It's the most powerful thing you can do to protect your microbiome during the course of antibiotics. But it's also very helpful for rebuilding. And you can add other microbes too. But now this is room temperature fermentation. So one of the things you have to start to get your arms around is there are room temperature fermenting microbes, and there are human body temperature fermenting microbes. So Reuteri, Gasseri, human body temperature, okay? Saccharomyces boulardii, Lactobacillus plantarum, Pediococcus pentasasius. These are microbes in fermented foods. They ferment at room temperature. So if you make that sparkling juice, but you want some more microbes, you can get a little bit of the brine, for instance, from your fermented pickles and put that in there, and you get those microbes. Luganostoc mesenteroides, Pediococcus species. But fermentation, whether room temperature or human body temperature, extremely powerful. So those are the seeds, okay? Now, here's the crazy thing about fermented foods. You consume, let's say, fermented pickles or the juices, the sparkling juices. They don't take up residence in your GI tract. You ingest them, they pass through, and you poop them out. So why are they so beneficial? What's become clear is those fermenting microbes, Luganostoc, Pediococcus, Lactobacillus plantarum, Saccharomyces boulardii, they go through and they're like farmers of beneficial microbes. They cultivate, feed the beneficial microbes, those like Akkermansia, Fecalibacterium, Lactobacillus species. Very powerful way to rebuild a microbiome. And then lastly, water and fertilize your garden. Well, there's no water, right? But you can fertilize them with fibers and related compounds. These are things like the inulin fructooligosaccharides in onions and garlic and shallots. It's the galacto-oligosaccharides in legumes like black beans, white beans, and chickpeas. It's the pectin in the rind and pulp, the rind of citrus fruits and apples. It's jicama. Remember, don't forget hyaluronic acid. Very important for rebuilding to feed your microbes. So think of it as a garden, right? Prepare the soil, plant the seeds, water and fertilize it. So easy.
Wow, that's so great. And there's so many supplements you recommend, like NAC to disrupt biofilms, and berberine and curcumin, essential oils, the antifungal and helping with everything. Cinnamon, clove, peppermint, oregano oils, so many things for various conditions. So Any more questions or comments? Well, do you have any final summaries or parting words for us? I mean, your wisdom is just very exhilarating. I mean, I'm just very excited about it and glad that we could share this.
You know, with regards specific to fermentation, don't make this tougher than it is. It really is simple. Once you get started, you say, "Oh, well, gee, what was the problem?" It's so simple. Whether it's yogurt, lactobacillus reuteri yogurt, the lactobacillus reuteri restoration is truly, in my many decade-long career, one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. I'm every day, I've been doing this for years, but every day I marvel at the effect. For instance, I'm a chronic insomniac. I have for decades struggled to sleep, had to take high-dose melatonin, tryptophan, GABA, all this kind of stuff. With Reuteri, I sleep straight through almost with no awakenings. By the way, I did ferment also another microbe called Lactobacillus casei, C-A-S-E-I, Shirota, S-H-I-R-O-T-A, sold as a commercial product called Yakult. It's a lousy product. It's skim milk and sugar, but it provides 6 billion counts of this microbe, Lactobacillus casei Shirota. So I co-fermented them, and lo and behold, I'm a chronic insomniac, sleeping 12 hours a night straight through, and a lot of my followers did the same thing. I had to stop it. Dr. Susan, I have things to do. We don't have time to sleep 12 hours. But I tell you that to illustrate, these are very powerful strategies. This is not take this and get a little gas. No. Take these things and enjoy magnificent effects. It could be Reuteri for restoration of oxytocin and restoration of muscle. Could be Gasteri to shrink your waistline. That's true. Could be Bacillus coagulans to reduce arthritis pain, reduce muscle injury during strenuous exercise or hard work. It could be Bifidobacterium infantis, so your child has better neurological maturation. These are big effects. These are not, take a little vitamin C and feel better. No, these are really big effects. But don't make it harder than it is.
And I think more details and specifics on how to make the yogurt and diet and recipes can be found in his book, Super Gut. I got mine off Amazon. So, this information is available, and I think this is such a wealth of knowledge. And so I thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dr. Susan. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much. Have any particular questions before I run off to my chiropractor?
Susan, I just want to tell everybody that I was in Dr. Davis's group that he has, and he has like Wednesday webinars,
Yes.
and it's all less than $300, and he answers every question everybody has, even if they have 4 questions, and it's really, really wonderful. So I just wanted to, and then he also has a Facebook group when you join, and everyone's answering all these questions about all the things they're fermenting and eating. I just wanted to say that to everybody.